Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Andrés, for hosting me and for giving me a chance to give a quick presentation. The thoughts in what follows stem in part from the argument that Dan Edelstein, Natasha Wheatley, and I made in an edited volume called Power and Time, but also from two of my own projects. One co-authored book called The Human Body in the Age of Catastrophe, which concerned the transformation of conceptions of the human body from about 1900 to about 1940, thanks to neurological and physiological concepts. And a second, more recent project called The Invention of Prehistory, which largely concerns not what happened in prehistory, but ideas about prehistory and the way that these have played a role in modern and contemporary political thinking. Now, I'm going to have a little bit more of a technical bit for a second before returning to the main thrust in order to explain what we were frustrated by, Dan, Natasha, and I, as we were starting out on this project around temporalities. There were 3 or 4 ways in which historians usually would discuss temporality. One version, which I think all of us who went to graduate school in history in the Anglo-American world, let's say, grew up in, had to do with this opposition between revolution on the one hand and reaction, stasis, order on the other. And in the scenario, we have an argument about the age of revolutions and the century of revolutions from 1776 and 1789, at least through 1917, as the key period for thinking about time. And time is either kind of stable, or time is alternatively punctuated by these moments of great crisis, which are exceptional, are disturbances, and are transformative, perhaps, or failed, alternatively. So that one scenario contrasted revolution with progress, or enabled other ideas of revolution as progress. It contrasted revolution with statehood, and in a way, it subsumed time under the rubric of progress versus revolution again, I suppose. A second system, which has become very successful in the Anglo-American world now, dates to Reinhard Koselleck's work in the late 1960s through the late 1980s, maybe even the early 1990s, which was a conception of multiple temporal regimes, that is to say, multiple orders of temporal existence that exist at any given moment in a society, so that, for example, agrarian life changes very slowly, but with the introduction of early modern to modern trade, and then of new technologies in the 18th and 19th century, especially trains in the 19th century, we move gradually to people experiencing time quite differently. So different strata of society experience it quite differently and experience a certain kind of acceleration at that time. This led to a proliferation of discussions about acceleration. I understand that you'll have Hartmut Rosa next week, who is also invested in that system. But it also linked to an approach that Koselleck understood as a way of organizing the temporality of concepts. Koselleck used to argue that concepts become both stabilized and become much more temporal, roughly in the period 1700 to 1850 or 1650 to 1850, with increasing agreement in the first half of the 19th century. That scenario, I think, isn't particularly helpful anymore. He called that period the Sattelzeit, the saddle time. But what it led to was a sense that conceptual transformations and temporal transformations afterward involve a kind of growing crisis. And that argument about crisis leads to his sense, derived in part from the legal and political thinker Carl Schmitt, that in the 20th century, we meet with a situation in which this crisis basically amounts to a kind of global civil war. Now, Koselleck only said this in his very early work, and then he pushed it aside. But this sense that, like, look, there's a stabilization period, there's a kind of dynamism, and then this looks like it's going haywire later, is not a particularly useful way for thinking about anything other than really the German states, or the little states formerly of the Holy Roman Empire that become part of the German Empire in 1871. Koselleck also has this model that feels a little bit like different temporal regimes are basically like sediments or like geological strata, and this too was not something we loved. It's not to say that this isn't highly productive. François Hartog, as you know, from the presentation last week, speaks of a way in which the present, for example, has become a very bloated temporal regime with both the past and the future disappearing roughly at present. But from my perspective, this was a kind of like meta theory that was not particularly useful for subjects that I was more interested in. The third idea that I found very tiresome eventually was the idea of acceleration. With great respect for people who argue with it, if you have a temporal argument about the 19th century, you can see this in a huge number of overviews, you will end up arguing that there is a certain acceleration that takes place at a particular moment. For Koselleck, this was 1830 to 1848. For Wolfgang Schwiebelbusch in The Railway Journey, it's the period both before and after this. For other authors, it's a little bit like you pick a period and you find it to be accelerating. And so while that is a useful, in many respects, way to understand that people experience time as speeding up around them, we would basically be arguing that at any given moment in time over the last couple of centuries, this acceleration has itself been accelerating over and over to the point where, just basic phenomenological experience of life doesn't really seems to reach a kind of conceptual limit that didn't really work. So as opposed to the order versus revolution and to the multiple geologically imagined temporal regimes, we tried to make an argument that we didn't have to think simply with metaphors of speed. These were only part of it, not simply with geological ideas, that we could think in a way where different approaches, different historical moments would have both multiple temporal regimes and different dynamics. Very often that they would have what we understood as conflicting temporal regimes. Now, there are many historians and anthropologists who have written on these subjects. Among my favorites are Nikolai Sorin-Chaikov's essay on birthday gifts to Stalin, Charles Stewart on dreaming and temporal and historical consciousness in Naxos, Caroline Arni on feminist temporality. I'm happy to email anybody who sends me a note about this. And a lot of the work that has been done more recently on imperial and post-imperial, anti-colonial, and queer temporalities. Now, the danger in the traditional approach is that we would see all these as exceptions. Our version was to say, when people are discussing moments of great conflict, that should be at the heart of what we think. And the concept that we tried to develop is a concept that we call chronosynosis. Chronosynosis is based on the earlier ideas of biosynosis, so like within a certain space, within a certain domain, what is, let's say, the sum total of competing biological organisms. A scenario that goes back ultimately to, not ideal biological and genetic understandings. And then a second set of ideas that follows from the concept of pathosynosis, which is a concept invented by the historian of medicine, Mirko Gremek, to argue that basically there are many pathogenic organisms in any given point in time. You have the emergence of a new one when others have basically receded or been, effectively get to disappear. For us, chronosynosis is a little bit like the idea that in any given, let's say, temporal landscape, you have multiple temporal orders, multiple temporal regimes, and these coexist, but most of the time they are in potential, at least potential conflict. So most of the time we don't, of course, feel them. We plainly forget about the fact that, there's something like legal time, or there's something like our metabolic time. We live with these without these creating some sort of crisis. But the idea of this argument is that at a time of crisis, suddenly these different pressures become much more pronounced. So we may exist with some temporal regimes that are fairly static, with other ones that are quite aggressive. We experience the transformations of technology either as pressure or as acceleration. We experience other elements of modern life in some way or other. But a lot of the time, we just simply go about our day. We don't necessarily think in these terms. In moments of crisis or revolution, all of these pressures become far more pronounced. And so the goal of the historian, we argued, or the goal of somebody who tries to work with concepts, is to try and pick apart or even pry apart different temporal modalities. Now, you can do this with one thinker, or you can do this with a whole period. You can do this in studying one author, because many of the concepts that they use have different temporal horizons. You can also study a particular moment in time where you don't simply say everybody was living a static life in the early modern period, but you try to ask, okay, what is the religious or church foundation for a certain temporality? What is the function of work, or what is the temporal function of work? What does it mean to think about distances? What does it mean to think about everyday life, and to think of these as potentially in some sort of crisis? With ideas, of course, this gets all the more pronounced. With ideas, we're no longer thinking in terms of individual temporal organizations, but we're trying to understand how people appeal to the past, how they project themselves into the future, in what way they inhabit their own time. What this schema offers is a sort of model that's not like a model from which you look up into everyday life, but a kind of, I prefer to think about it as like that idea of a four-dimensional cube, of a tesseract, in which, yes, there's no point at which in life as we experience it, that model is played out as though it had prescribed it. But it gives us some orienting elements from which we can return to life itself. The reason for this is that theories of time and history tend toward highly totalizing schemas. We talk about modernity, we talk about capitalism, we talk about, let's say, national histories. Here, the goal would be, however specific the particular space in which we're working, we might be able to understand different elements, from the great to the small. Now, in the invention of prehistory, I was quite struck by the different ways in which concurrent times, concurrent temporal regimes, concurrent historicities worked out. I was interested in moments when people appealed to the deep past, the early, origins of humanity, in order to organize ideas about their present, and in order to think about their future in some particular way. Now, the most pronounced expression of this in the book has to do with Nazi time. It has to do with the way that National Socialists, both as ideologues and also as a government, found themselves with multiple different ways of looking at origins and multiple different ways of looking at what it is that they were doing in their own time. So we have examples of them thinking in terms of a survival of the fittest, a kind of how do you impose racial purity in order to survive as the fittest? That's like the hyper one version of all of this is classic German anti-Semitism and racism, classic Nazi anti-Semitism and racism, but it has very different dimensions. So one is the survival of the fittest model. Another is this idea that right within the temporal horizon is an invasion of Judeo-Bolshevik hordes. This is an invasion whose effects are internally invisible, but which supposedly justified political action against the Soviet Union and against Jews living in Germany. They some of the upper echelons of the Nazi regime lived and thought with this ruin theory of value that both Hitler and Speer talk about, namely this idea that great societies build great structures that then make for great ruins 1,000 years later. So that's one fantasy, but you see a kind of temporal movement into the future. You have a reliance on fantasies about ancient Germanic barbarians. You have other fantasies that are about opposing the barbarians. You have a kind of Indo-German or Indo-European and Aryan belief in a kind of creators of culture theory, then the rise and the fall of a racial self-consciousness, which becomes really important as the Second World War begins. You have a whole messianic fantasy. All of these are quite different temporal orientations. Some of them involve a return to the supposed nature. Some of them involve the sense of pressure by the future. Some of them involve a fantasy of living, functioning, acting forever, or of operating in a messianic time. And then, of course, you have all these other Nazi ideas around building a new man who will not be threatened by either internally or politically externally, but who will forge a new society into the future. Now, this may just be like the concoction more than anything else of the Nazi case. Their ideas may sound flimsy, but as you know, these ideas contribute or sort of click with one another to create this ideological cohesion and to justify violence, justify war, and justify in many respects, justify the Holocaust. Now, this isn't, however, only about the Nazi case, and I think I have about another 4 minutes at most. This isn't only about the Nazi case. You see very different ways of relying on biology and society in post-war ideas about human equality. You have arguments about biological temporality, especially in theories of aggression, supposedly innate human aggression, which speak of our supposed long-standing propensity to violence, and which, Australopithecines being violent, look at violence in the present time. Authors in the 60s will routinely cite the Holocaust, and then appeal to a new order, to keeping order. By comparison, you have others who think in social terms about human origins, or who think in terms of tool-making, where different theorists of the man, the toolmaker approach, that we are fundamentally tool-making beings since Australopithecine times, according to them, we tend to articulate a vision, they tend to articulate a vision in which technology is beginning to escape from human hands and progress beyond humanity, so that we are kind of stuck as it moves on. I'm not implying that any of these individual systems are the only way in which people think. I mean that whether politically or in intellectual moments, you have authors thinking in multiple different ways at once as regards how time works. And I'm suggesting that it's essential for us to be able to understand how a system like this would work. So my point is not that temporality is a matter of constant conflict. It's not, my argument is not that temporality is simply reducible to what one thinker thinks about the history of humanity, but rather that what we usually experience as linear time, as the time that we go past our day, from that we get to work, that we return from work, that we eat and sustain ourselves, the time that we sleep, the time that we engage with doctors or the law or other matters, these are all somewhat different temporal orientations, which in the everyday passing of time, we do not experience as fundamentally divergent. Most of the time, we live in a kind of concordance of these temporalities, but sometimes these get pulled and pried apart. At other times, they justify for ourselves what it is that we think about politics or other subjects. So time goes by normally, let's say, when we don't think about these pressures, but these pressures remain forever hidden. In order to study time, we can't simply rely on the idea of order or an idea of acceleration or an idea of a revolution. We have to be able to think how it is that multiple different aspects of time play themselves out in the thought of particular people, in the social order of a given moment, and in the dynamics and engagement of, anything from a particular text to a whole society. Thank you. That was a little too long. Sorry, Nick.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. And I know Andrés will be joining us here too. I'd like to begin. There are a couple of things that you mentioned. One is I wanted to talk about this idea of chronosynosis itself, but maybe we'll come back to that because I'm interested in something that it's a question that really arises from the etymology of the term. But first, since you began by criticizing that model that you find in Koselleck and in Artaud as well, of these historical regimes of historicity, temporal regimes, and both of them acknowledge the multiplicity, the possibility of simultaneous existence of different ones.
Mm-hmm.
But I think both also tend to emphasize one at a given time, at least in the West. And I wondered, is that part of really what's the issue? It's not the question of simultaneity of the non-simultaneous. It's more the dominance or kind of normative, de facto normative model. So a historicizing model and then or presentist model. And for Koselleck, for example, we have the idea of the modern historicizing one, which replaces an earlier cyclical regime, and he dates that, pretty firmly in the middle of the 18th century, and that what you called noted as the Sattelzeit, the saddle time, from 1750 to 1850. And I agree entirely. That model is, I think, very problematic. And indeed, the book I'm writing now is intended precisely to challenge that in the aesthetic realm. But I wondered, is the fundamental objection here to that model not the question of multiplicity or different temporal regimes, but the de facto dominance of one and the normative one, and saying this is the one we're in now?
I think it's definitely this is the one we're in now. That's something I don't understand. I don't understand in what way we would suggest that there's a given regime in a particular period. It's, it would be, I don't want to overplay this to the point of the ridiculous, but, yours is different than mine. I think that that's, in a way, the periodization that we all feel about life, the way in which we understand and sense it is quite different in the sense that we have of history. If we start with a dominant one, we end up having discussions about generations and so on and so forth. I don't find it very productive. I also think there's something about the multiplicity which just isn't tense enough. That is to say, there's something about it's as though it goes a long way but doesn't actually quite reach it. What would we really begin with in describing multiple temporalities? Would we begin by a kind of historical process of building and then deciding when we just keep building onto the next ones and how these might relate to one another? Or do we shift, or do we think about it conceptually? Or do we shift into saying perhaps that, yes, there is an essential multiplicity. That essential multiplicity has to be understood as a kind of constant competition. Think, for example, of all the different languages, or all the different ways in which the French Revolution is discussed, was presented as a break with the past, right? Like already in 1789, in late 1789, people talk of the Ancien Régime as an old kind of clearly done and done. You have the whole discussion about the rights of man, which human beings have been deprived of and need to receive again. We have ideas about the urgency of political action. We have competitions regarding, let's say during we have competitions to imagine new periodization. So, for example, the revolutionary calendar. So it's a little bit like all these things exist, and clearly people are kind of pulled back and forth a little bit by them, but we couldn't actually begin to say what it is that it begins with. And as we know from Tocqueville, for example, the French Revolution didn't change very much for a good number of social orders living and functioning in France. So I prefer to think of these as somewhat spaces for possible competition, in which the question is, okay, does the revolutionary calendar do anything at this moment? And in what way do we begin to look at this effect? Does anybody actually really say the Ancien Régime? Or is that a term that's used in a particular stratum? It's about thinking of this as this kind of, tub almost, in which multiple different vectors are moving. And I tend to think that there's much more that we can do, because it helps us avoid a kind of Eurocentric story of modernity. And it helps us to be able to look at elements of society or figures within society who don't necessarily think about time in those terms. The Carolina Arni essay that I mentioned earlier is an amazing piece about a woman who's a Saint-Simonian and writes a manifesto for women's liberation in the 1820s or 1830s, and then commits suicide. And the question of that document is like, okay, so what does it mean to have a programmatic text while removing oneself from the future that happens? How does this relate to the way Saint-Simonians think about time, or the way that the French government thinks about time, about multiple elements regarding women and then contemporary society and so on? All of that is just completely removed, or that dynamic, that question. And that question, it's up to us to decide, given whatever it is that we're studying philosophically, historically, it's up to us to decide whether that's actually important for our project. But the point is, it is there too. And
Yeah,
it shouldn't
quickly,
simply be an exception. Sorry.
very quickly, one thing about Koselleck is that he tends to privilege self-conscious reflections on history and historical time. And of course, after the French Revolution, there's a great deal of talk about that. But then by 1804, under Napoleon, many of the supposed advances of the French Revolution had in fact been reversed, including the reintroduction of slavery in Haiti and so on. So you could argue that these revolutionary promises had been unfulfilled. But the discourse of history doesn't necessarily correspond to historical facts or experiences. So.
Right. I think that's both a strength and a certain weakness in the Koselleck model. I think that the argument about horizon of expectation and space of experience is really fascinating as a phenomenological approach. It also has its limits. So as you mentioned, 1804, I'm trying to write something about the Napoleon and the instauration of the French Civil Code. And the very interesting thing that they do in the first three meetings that they discuss the draft code in Napoleon's presence, is to try and decide whether the law applies at the same moment across the entire territory, or whether it radiates out from Paris. And so they have to decide that there's a temporal synchrony at the legal level. But what does that mean? Does it mean that a law gets promulgated by Napoleon, but then it has to wait for a certain period of time until it reaches the edges? Or does he promulgate it and whoever's in front of him is immediately there? What does it mean to be equal subjects? Becomes a really major issue. And they have all these fights back and forth, himself included, as to what is the proper sovereignty and will of the law, meaning also of Napoleon, and what are the different factors for building a new society on these legal terms. So that's the sort of fun part, where these elements come to be, it's entirely unclear what the subject of this time exactly is going to be. But it is clear at the same time that the legal domain gets to be somewhat transformed. The state gets to be somewhat transformed, even as other elements are completely collapsing of all the promises, just as you said, of all the revolution's promises, as you just said.
I'd like to follow up, Stefanos, by asking about what happens when we move from this model of multiplicity to a more conflictual model, because I think there's a question that arises then about the sites in which those conflicts are worked out, and I'm curious as to whether within your schema you think there is a kind of privileged site or a set of privileged sites. And I'm thinking particularly about the question of the relation between social practices as that which might be said to ground these different rhythms, these different temporalities, and ways of representing time and temporality. Would you say it's too schematic to privilege one over the other? And if not, is there some way in which we can address their combination? I mean, do you think we just have to kind of embed ourselves in a kind of conjunctural analysis, or is there a privileged side?
I think it's the latter. I think that we're closer to this need to embed ourselves in a particular subject. I remember that little bit that I was trying to sketch out, unfortunately not clearly enough, regarding the sort of tesseract rather than model idea. It's not about having a model and thinking up. It's about having something like a kind of suspension system from which we can draw different elements, given the particular space in which we're thinking. If you're giving, if you are giving an overarching history, let's say of the 20th century, that's one scenario. Then you have a particular set of questions regarding time. You have to make decisions as to whether this is going to be state-based, internationally based, time-based. It's a complicated game somehow. If you are thinking about studying, something really specific, then the terms really change quite a bit. Then you could say this is about a social practice, or this is about a particular kind of representation. But my hope is that you can say that both of these are things that one can work with. That, individual texts, social practices, forms of including aesthetic representation, these are matters to be played out on each occasion differently, on each occasion with a different, let's say with a different set of priorities or with a different set of intellectual questions in play. But I don't really have a sense that there is an exact prearranged site. So in the Power and Time book, some of this has to do with, one chapter has to do with the cryopreservation of indigenous samples, of indigenous DNA samples. In other cases, I wrote more specifically about the Nazi new man idea and the kind of imagined temporality of this new man. Natasha Wheatley writes about, constitutional and international law as one develops out of the other and contributes to shaping this idea of historical right. So these are very different objects, is what I'm trying to say. And in each occasion, the fantasy is that this idea of multiple and conflicting regimes can give both a sense of moments of crisis. It can allow us a way into looking at concepts used as different ones. And at the same time, it can give a sense of dynamism. I feel bad not to have pushed quite enough into the dynamism angle, whereby here we both have an element of dynamism, not necessarily led by temporal conflict, but also elements of potentially static periods punctuated in some particular form, without depending on one or the other. At that, yeah.
Can I ask a question that really follows up from Andres's, and that is, you began the remarks by sort of emphasizing conflicting temporalities, but you ended them by emphasizing multiplicity and say that we can't reduce things to conflict. And that's where my question about the chronosynosis and the etymology of the term, because koinosis in Greek, of course, means sharing and mingling rather than conflict. And I wondered, is that sort of what you want to emphasize rather than conflictual, but the multiplicity itself? And your point at the end that in daily life, we have different temporalities, but we don't necessarily experience them as conflicting with one another.
Mm-hmm. I think, yes, I've overstated perhaps the conflict angle as opposed to the cooperative or the coexisting angle. Toward the end, I think what I was at pains to suggest was that I didn't want somebody to walk out of this room with a feeling that suddenly that I'm somehow claiming that at all possible times there's like a crazy temporal set of conflicts that and we're just plainly ignoring them. No, we sort of live with some of them and have to negotiate how we're going to relate to them as we go. However, that potential for conflict I wanted to suggest is very much there. That is the angle I wanted to accentuate. Yes, most of the time we go about our lives paying relatively little attention to the question of temporality. We have all these ways of expressing, all these metaphors for expressing moments of surprise or shock or change. Those will be ones that we reach for, let's say, at particular moments. I was thinking of let's say a temporality of boredom, for example, where nothing really is happening, regardless of whatever is happening. So yes, I may be overstating the conflict, but the necessary bit for me, I think, is that potential for conflict is always there. And that's what then looks like revolution, if you will. That's what revolution, sorry, not that's what looks like revolution, that's what revolution looks like. You mentioned the synchronicity of the asynchronous earlier. I was thinking that on my mind is more an asynchronicity of the synchronous, that everything that whatever we seem to experience as synchronous is happening along somewhat different temporal orders. And nevertheless, we live and enjoy and fear and get anxious without that being, without that being somehow resolved. I think the resolution is what I was trying to avoid rather than something else. Yeah.
I mean, it seems in your account like experience plays quite a kind of central role, and I know that aesthetic experience in particular is key within this schema. I'm wondering about how all of those mechanisms of synchronization that operate, if you like, behind the back of experience fit into this picture. So just to give one example, I'm thinking about the world market as a kind of giant machine for the synchronization of different lived temporalities. This is something that Massimiliano Tomba talks about, how the world rhythm of accumulation plays this synchronizing function, and it's the state's role to kind of violently bring everyone into coordination. So how do you kind of figure this kind of unseen process of synchronization when experience seems to be so central?
So, yes, I appreciate that experience is used here very vaguely and somewhat insufficiently. The way that I would put it is that I was thinking of this, you went, let's say, the way of the economic market, and I was trying to go before the way of the law as another one that's, yes, it's a point of shock, but most people don't spend their time thinking about the temporality of the law until they've run afoul of it, so to speak. We don't tend to be aware of how long trials take. We don't tend to be aware of what a lifetime of incarceration means. We have a sense of it as in the abstract, but we don't relate to it until that happens. And so it functions, it structures without our cognizance of it. I would say something similar about economic times, both about economic crises, the sense of urgency in 2008 and later the debt crises in Southern Europe, as producing both these elements of kind of concurrent urgency, felt differently in different strata. And at the same time, a measure of helplessness or a measure of profound limitation rather than possible resolution. So I'm not about to suggest, and I would not want to come off saying that this is a kind of phenomenological argument, because that's part of what I think is sort of limited in Koselleck. But at the same time, it seems to me interesting and important that we be able to speak about this kind of underneath rather than anything, or that we be able to speak about particular objects from, given books to from given books to aesthetically significant objects within a given society. So, yeah, I think that's that. That's as far as I would say. It's in a way, I wanted to evacuate the sense that the experiencing subject is the judge here, but the experiencing subject does give us a lot of information, and and we may feel as that experiencing subject when time seems not to change, or when time seems to function in a kind of boring everyday manner.
Could I ask, what would the implications for historical periodization be. I mean, periods often present themselves as being descriptive and neutral, but in often be, or in practice, they tend to be normative as well. Can we, if given your earlier comments about not wanting a kind of dominant idea, the idea of a dominant temporal regime, can we practice periodization? Can we speak of modernity or the Middle Ages or antiquity or something like that? Are these concepts no longer meaningful?
I think that they're not meaningful in principle, in the sense that they are given. So I don't think that this is a matter about temporality. I think this is something that we all sort of have to suddenly deal with. The heuristic usage, potentially creative usage, or categorical significance of periods. But then we go into a particular subject and a particular cares, and there we end up we ought to be renegotiating them in principle. So at the same time, yes, I tend to think that if the what Andrés referred to, or what either of you referred to, suddenly I'm blanking, as an embodied or a kind of an embedded effort at research and writing. If we started out with that, then yes, I think that the chronosynosis argument helps us step away from an accepted periodization, really depending on what the object of study is. So, I'm trying to think of an example in which it's not necessarily clear what begins and what ends, or when I was trying to give the example I used earlier of the sort of invention of the Ancien Régime in 1789, 1790. We can think of the invention of the Middle Ages or the invention of feudalism as arguments that have to do partly with a kind of temporality of a world that's kind of in its ruins, imposing on the present. Those are expressions that are elaborately used both in the later 18th century and among scholars. But that would, again, at other times, modernity would be utterly essential. It would just sort of depend on what the project is about. It would be difficult to get rid of these categories once and for all, but that they be more plastic. I think that certainly I wouldn't take credit for that, but I would love to. I think that would be a good effect of this, this sort of engagement. Yeah.
They tend to be so deeply institutionalized, though, that it's hard to get out of.
Right. Right. I mean, I've ended up in the middle of discussions between colleagues of mine who work on the exact same period and are harshly opposed to each other's uses of the term modernity for Russia, for example. Like absolutely, like no discussion possible. Yes, and I guess that in some ways, depending on what you're looking at, a category will end up being more or less useful. If an argument about temporal complexity is helpful in undercutting that, and by all means, I love that setup, without claiming that, of course, concepts don't mean something or that they don't have a kind of residual value. Of course, they're there. Of course, we have to negotiate them, whatever they are, in different circumstances and with different aims.
I have lots more questions I'd like to ask, but I've seen that we've got lots of questions that have come in from the audience, so maybe we should move on to taking some of those.
Okay, well, this is my role, so I will jump in there. As Andrés said, lots of questions. Obviously, if any of you see any particularly want to go to, feel free to do that, because we probably won't have enough time. But I'll just start at the top with a question from Alice, who says, I guess, moving into a philosophical direction, Henri Bergson emphasized the difference between subjective and objective time, placing greater emphasis on the former. Stefanos, does your account allow for multiple versions of both subjective and objective time, all potentially in conflict? Thank you.
Yes. So I think that the answer to this is a very straightforward yes, because the idea is not the idea, first off, is that we would be, under different circumstances, what appears as subjective time would be fundamentally different. You could even suggest that in any given, even in the same subject, what appears as subjective time could be fundamentally, it would involve multiples. As for objective time, at some level, I find the notion really unhelpful. Same thing with linear time. It's partly why I was using this experience-based idea before, in order to suggest that there is a kind of we have a kind of agreement that we're going through time, so to speak, that there's the time passes, all these expressions. But I find that fundamentally unhelpful for thinking as a researcher. I tend to think that that produces a kind of coagulation of different temporal priorities or pressures that don't immediately take place. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't go through life, or the time doesn't pass, and so on and so forth. It just means that I think that's the one thing that we should be stepping away from as well as we can, until we figure out what kind of aesthetic synthesis it offers us at the end. So yes, I tend to think that the answer to your question would be that yes, the idea of multiple temporalities, that it crosses across the subjective objective setup. I like the question about queer temporalities as well, if I might just jump into that immediately. It is not meant as an argument about a particular population, if you prefer. And the argument comes from Lee Edelman's book, in which the suggestion is that fundamentally queerness involves a rejection. Now I'm parroting here, and it's been a little while since I last read it. But fundamentally, queerness involves the rejection of certain kinds of organized temporality. For example, traditional biologically derived family organization and the time that would be attached to that. So in this regard, Edelman imagined, or I don't want that to sound derogatory, Edelman argued fundamentally that there is a different relationship to the future than one would experience in a kind of in a procreatively organized life. There are many other elements to that book to suggest that indeed there is something specific to queer temporality. But here I am using this just marginally to suggest that what I wouldn't want is for that argument to sound like an exception on its own. Of course, there are things that would be exceptional or specific to different groups. We can't say that time isn't gendered in rather obvious ways. But at the same time, I wouldn't it to sound like something that there's like a kind of normative time, and then there's like the edges of it, and we can either pay attention to them or ignore them. I hope that this half covers Anonymous's question in this frame, and that I can direct you back to the Edelman No Future book for the rest of this element.
Okay, super. Yeah, just to clarify, the question that Stefanos just answered was, I'm unsure what it may mean to have a temporality rooted in a particular population, e.g. you mentioned queer temporalities. What is meant by queer or related temporalities? That's great. On the topic, we do actually have a second question from Casey at the bottom, which says, considering the concept of queer time you briefly alluded to at the beginning, how might we reimagine a world that embraces parallel personal temporalities, like those of time zones around the world, for people who deviate from normative rites of passage? Would this lead to even more individualized fragmentation, or could there be a possibility of a new historical paradigm where conflict transforms into cooperation and reconciliation?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. So I think this is a very big question where half of me wants to answer in one direction and then the other half objects. the way that I would probably put it is that, so what would it mean for it to aim for increased or individualized fragmentation? I don't think that I would want an argument that basically amounts to there's 6 or however many billion people on Earth, everybody lives a different time kind of. I wouldn't want something that suggests no commonalities. So there is a way in which particular deviations do suggest a different experience of time, or do suggest a different set of temporal tensions. So does it make a difference that these are, across different societies? In principle, the concept would probably be somewhat different. And the language for describing this kind of time would, at least in theory, be somewhat different if we were concerning different languages. However, I would also want us to be able to say that there are shared experiences across, or there are shared experiences of time, there are shared social elements, particularly in the last 50 and then the last 20 years, across considerable geographical distances. It doesn't mean that the circumstances are the same or the argument is exactly the same. It would seem to me, nevertheless, to suggest that, yes, there are ways of rejecting what social order demands that lead to a particular kind of, temporal engagement with the world. Queerness might be an example. I'm not sure. Could we say that there is something about old age that would be an example of, experiencing socially acceptable time from one perspective, and that perspective might actually be much the same across some societies? I think that sounds plausible. I'm not sure that I would either answer your question entirely in one direction or entirely in the other at the same time. Like, not too much fragmentation, not too much answering it in advance before the particular example came up.
Thank you. So I'll ask one more question, just at the sort of almost basics level, and then maybe we could get Andrés and Nick to come back in. So this is another anonymous question. In what way does your account generate anxiety as per the title of the series? Relatedly, what kind of understanding of temporality might minimize human anxiety? So I think that's another nice sort of general question, and then maybe Nick and Andrés could come on to sort of reflect on anything that's been said in the Q&A so far.
So I tended to think that in this argument, something like anxiety, particularly if we are, so I understood the title closer to historical anxiety, let's say, a kind of anxiety around one's historicity, or a questioning of what the status of history is in the, in the way we live now, if you prefer. There's another question that mentions this later. So I'm not sure that there's a prescriptive way for dealing with human anxiety that would come out of the argument that I would have here. I'm very much indebted to the arguments around, the debates around what anxiety means in the 1930s. In the 20s and 30s, particularly by a neurophysiologist called Kurt Goldstein. But I don't think that I have something particularly intelligent to say around that. For Goldstein, anxiety arises when the world has become so disordered for him. It's a very non-Freudian argument. When the world has become so disordered that we at once strive for order and are threatened with a kind of catastrophe. That's one scenario. Of course, Freudian anxiety is quite different in that form. So we could have this sort of long debate. At any rate, I'm not sure that I can give any help in that regard. What I do think the subject offers is, let's say, the argument around time, the argument around chronosynosis in this is, I think, a helpful explanation, or can participate in a study of anxiety on the principle. It helps think about anxiety on the principle that this kind of multiplicity and potential non-cooperation or non-coextensiveness of these temporal regimes contributes to a sense that of a world in disorder, contributes to a world of pressures, if you will. It is those pressures that I think can be experienced as anxiety if we were going on the time and anxiety front. But that would be the extent to which I would think about anxiety in relation to time. That is to say, that anxiety is one temporal mode for existing, and it reflects both internal and external problems and problematics in a kind of almost confrontational approach. I would tend to think that this becomes a priority or a subject of study under quite specific circumstances, or under what I was referring to earlier as a mode of crisis. I'm very willing to accept that that's not the best way to put it, and I'm willing to give this another try, but I think that's about the extent to which I could manage it.
Super. So, Nick and Andres, any response to any of the questions or to any of Stefanos's engagement with the questions?
Well, I'll just say something in response to the last question, which is that there certainly does seem to be a strong sense of historical anxiety in the air, as it were. And I wonder if in some sense this is bound up with the demise of a certain consensus around the idea of progress. I mean, of course, there are very strong strains of kind of techno-scientific progressivism, kind of eco-modernist view. But I think there's also kind of widespread recognition of the fact that many of the promises of kind of enlightenment, modernity, and progress have failed to actualize themselves. And, in the light of ecological catastrophe, wars and conflict, political turbulence, a failure of young people, particularly in the so-called advanced capitalist countries, to see a kind of a rise in their living standards. All of these things are kind of, I think, cast doubt on this idea of progress. And I think there's a real sense of anxiety in that, the underlying compulsion to still participate in the dynamics of capitalism, the dynamics of capital accumulation, are driving people onwards. There is some sense of kind of development, but it's become decoupled from this sense of a kind of progress towards a better life. And I think that's one way of thinking about this state of historical anxiety we find ourselves in.
Right, and I'm very much in agreement with you on this. It's as though half of the meaning of the word progress relies on an outdated fantasy regarding social progress and regarding particular improvement and living standards, inequality and so on. And part of the concept of progress at this point is entirely technologized and entirely dehumanizing in its own form. Now, versions of this exist really all the way to the 1930s. But it does seem to me that this is a perfectly good account of this sense that, on the one hand, the value of history appears to be disappearing, insofar as historical lessons appear to be losing in value, something that Koselleck talks about the 17th century as well. So that's one. The sense that, no matter of what one does, indeed, capitalism and technological and technopolitical changes become all the more decoupled from life, except for some. Those scenarios are quite essential to the sense of loss. Now, I think all I was trying to suggest before is this, how one would go about this link of time and anxiety. And I think in that regard, you gave the a much thicker explanation than the version which I was trying to just vaguely outline as to that sense of pressure, or let's say, that sense of pressure against the future and the sense of loss at the same time. Yeah.
And I'd say related to this is that something has come up in several of the questions, is that it's the relationship or the conflict between individually experienced time and sort of socially imposed conceptions of time or regimes of time, and and that misalignment in which one's individual experience no longer corresponds to this promise of social progress. And that's, I mean, this is part of what Hartog and Hans-Ulrich Gumbrecht and others have analyzed under the banner of presentism, but also what Hartmut Rosa's analyzed under the rubric of alienation and acceleration. So there's a sense of their individual experiences of time that don't correspond to the larger ones, or seem, and there's no way that they can seem to be reconciled. And then that's reinforced by units of time that we can't really comprehend, deep time, or even time in the Anthropocene, or a future involving our demise. These can't be reconciled with individual experience, and so that produces an anxiety in itself.
I'm entirely with you in this scenario. Entirely with you in this scenario. I think in part, this is what I found, or this is what I think I can speak for Dan Edelstein and Natasha Wheatley as well, in saying this is what we found so lacking, and what we wanted a better language or a better model or kind of super model for thinking about. We tended to think that the normative dimension becomes one where things get pressed out of the way. But I mean, think of, I don't know, think of India in the 1950s or 1960s. Think of newly decolonized societies in which different versions of such anxiety would also be very, very prevalent. The promises came, one version of oppression is gone, and yet different versions of oppression have caught on, and one didn't quite manage to make it. Think of that. I think it was that sort of scenario and the regularity thanks to which these alternatives to a kind of supposedly official time that led us to try and play on the subject. Yeah, and toward this idea of both conflict and dynamism, that we kind of needed a bit better sense of a dynamism that can be highly threatening, can be, to a scholar, can be quite promising.